She scrubbed palace floors with bleeding hands while her mate crowned another woman queen. 5 years. 5 years of silence, submission, and slow erasure. Because Alpha King Darius Blackmoor decided a Luna with no pack, no family, no army was a Luna worth nothing. He was wrong. Every stone she cleaned remembered her name. Every scar she hid carried a bloodline older than his entire kingdom. This is the story of the woman he thought he'd broken. And the night she proved empires built on cruelty don't survive the women they underestimate. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. Let's go. The water in the bucket had gone gray before the third corridor. Selene Ashthorne pressed her palm flat against the cold marble and pushed herself upright, her spine straightening one vertebra at a time like a structure deciding whether to hold. The rag in her left hand was soaked through, heavy as a drowned animal. She wrung it over the bucket. The water that came out was the color of ash. Down the hallway she could hear them. Laughter first, the high, practiced kind that palace women learn to perform. Then his voice, low and certain, the kind of voice that never once in 5 years had asked her a question it actually wanted answered. She did not look up. The torches along the Silver Fang Palace corridor threw shadows that moved wrong, stretched too long, flickered when there was no wind. It was a drafty building, old bones under all the new stone Darius had added since taking full command of the kingdom 3 years back. Selene knew every draft in this palace. She knew them because she had cleaned around them, felt them cut through her thin work clothes on winter mornings when the rest of the palace was still asleep, when it was just her and the marble and the specific silence of a place that had stopped recognizing her as anything other than furniture. The laughter got louder, closer. She moved the bucket 6 inches to the right and kept scrubbing. "You missed a spot." The voice belonged to Mira Holden. It always did. Selene did not stop moving the rag. She registered the sound of heels, sharp, deliberate, the kind of footsteps designed to announce arrival, and kept her eyes on the floor. "I said you missed a spot, Luna." The word Luna came out of Mira's mouth the way spoiled fruit smelled. Technically correct. Structurally rotten. Selene sat back on her heels and looked up. Mira Holden was everything the court had decided a woman in power should look like. Dark hair arranged in the style the capital favored this season. A gown the color of deep wine. A face that had learned early how to arrange itself into expressions that communicated authority without ever having to earn any. She was 26. She had been Darius's favored mistress for 3 of the 5 years Selene had been installed as his Luna, and she had spent those 3 years conducting what amounted to a slow, meticulous demolition of every structural support holding Selene's position together. She was also, Selene noted with the flat attention of someone who had been cataloging threats for a very long time, slightly nervous tonight, something in the set of her jaw, a micro-tension around the eyes. Interesting. "Show me," Selene said. Mira blinked. "What?" "The spot I missed. Show me where it is." The corridor was spotless. Selene had been cleaning it for 2 hours. Mira looked at the floor, found nothing to point to, and reset her expression into something more certain. "Don't get clever with me. The Alpha has guests arriving for the moon ascension preparations tomorrow. He expects this entire wing presentable. It will be presentable. It needs to be done by it will be done." Selene looked back at the floor. Was there something else? The silence that followed had texture to it. Mira was deciding something, whether to escalate, whether the power she had was sufficient to justify escalating, whether Selene's tone had crossed a line she could report. Selene had learned to read that silence the way hunters learn to read wind direction. "The Alpha will be entertaining in the West Garden tonight," Mira said finally. "You are not to appear there." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." The heels moved, stopped. "And Selene, the guest quarters on the 3rd floor still need fresh linens. Tonight." She left. Selene looked at the water in the bucket for a moment. Then she picked up the rag and kept working. The palace at night was a different animal than the palace in daylight. In daylight, it performed. Banners hung straight. Guards stood at precise intervals. The court processed through its corridors in the choreography of power. Who walked first, who bowed how deeply, who was permitted to speak in which rooms. Selene had once moved through those patterns as Luna, as the Alpha King's mate, as a woman whose position should have commanded deference from every soul in the building. Should have. At night, the palace dropped the performance. The corridors echoed. The servants moved in quick, economical patterns, getting work done before the court woke and demanded their attention again. The kitchen fires burned low. The guards on the outer walls talked to each other in the quiet way of men who had stopped pretending they might actually have to defend anything. And Selene moved through all of it like a woman who had learned to take up no space. She carried the linens to the third floor herself. 2 other servants had offered, younger women, newer to the palace, who had not yet learned that associating with the Luna's tasks was a liability in this court. Selene had declined. She'd told them she had it handled. She hadn't said what she actually meant, which was, "I do not want witnesses to where I'm going." The third-floor guest quarters were at the end of the north wing. 4 rooms. 2 of them were already prepared. The third was locked, had been locked for 6 months, ever since Darius had informed her, without explanation, that it was off-limits to cleaning staff. She stopped at the 4th room, put down the linens, looked at the locked door. Then she reached into the pocket of her work apron and took out a key. It was old, bone-handled, the kind of key made before Silverfang had standardized its lock systems. She had found it 3 months ago in a crack between the third floor's north wall and the floor, barely visible under the baseboard she'd been scrubbing. It had taken her another 6 weeks to confirm what it opened. She put it in the lock, turned it. The room beyond was cold and dark and had not been properly aired in a long time. She did not light the lamp. She moved by feel, by memory. She had been in this room once before, briefly, when she first found the key, just long enough to understand what she was looking at. The walls were covered in maps, old ones, the kind of maps that used the old border names, the names from before Silverfang had expanded, before the Consolidation Wars, before the year that no one in this palace ever spoke about directly, that came up only in oblique references, in pauses in certain conversations, in the particular way Darius changed the subject whenever the Eastern territories came up. Selene moved to the desk in the corner. She didn't need to see the papers clearly. She had memorized what mattered the last time she was here. But she needed to confirm one specific document was still where she'd left it. It was. She touched the edge of it with one finger, didn't pick it up. The document was a field report, 22 years old. It detailed the coordination of what it called a pacification operation in the Eastern Highlands, the region that had once been the seat of the Emberwolf royal bloodline. It listed the names of the pack leaders who had coordinated. It listed the names of the Silverfang commanders who had provided tactical support. One of those names was Darius Blackmoor. He had been 18. He had been his father's military adjutant. He had been following orders, arguably, in the way that young men in powerful families always had the option of claiming they'd been following orders. Selene had found this document 4 months ago. She had read it 8 times. She had not moved it, touched it, or done anything that would indicate she knew it existed. She was 24 years old. She had been 7 when the pacification operation happened. She had not been in the Eastern Highlands that year. She'd been fostered with a distant relative in the Western lowlands, separated from her family by a piece of luck she had not understood until much later was not luck at all, but planning. Someone had moved her before the operation. Someone had known what was coming. She had spent 5 years as Darius's Luna figuring out who that someone was. She locked the room behind her, made the beds in the guest quarters with precise, economical movements, carried the extra linens back to the linen room on the 2nd floor, returned to the corridor on the ground level, and finished the section she'd been working on when Mira interrupted her. By the time the palace clock struck the 2nd hour past midnight, the wing was immaculate. Selene emptied the bucket in the service courtyard and went to her room. Her room was on the servants' corridor. That had been the first concrete removal, 3 years ago, 18 months into the relationship between Darius and Mira, when the court had begun to sense which way the current was running. Selene had been moved from the Luna's chambers on the 2nd floor to a room on the servants' level. The official reason given was renovation of the Luna's quarters. The renovation had never started. The quarters had been given, 6 months later, to Mira. Selene had not contested it. She'd learned early, Earlier than most people in her position, she thought, because she'd been running calculations since the day she arrived in this palace. That the moment you contested something you couldn't win, you telegraphed what you valued, and the moment this court knew what you valued, they had a tool to use against you. So she let them have the room. She let them have the title's function, the seat at council meetings, the right to be consulted on pack matters, the deference from the servants, the position at ceremonies. She let them strip it down piece by piece over 5 years, and she watched each piece go with the quiet, attentive expression of a woman who was keeping very careful inventory. Her room had a narrow window that looked out over the service courtyard. A bed, a table, a chair. She'd added a small iron stove the second winter, when she realized no one was going to question whether the Luna's accommodations included adequate heat, because no one thought of her as the Luna anymore. She sat on the edge of the bed and unwrapped her hands. The knuckles were raw. The right palm had a split along the heel that had reopened sometime in the second corridor. She'd felt it happen and just pressed the rag harder and kept moving. She cleaned the splits with water from the pitcher on her table and wound strips of cloth around both hands with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly. Then she sat still. Outside, she could hear the west garden. Faint. Music, voices, the specific cadence of an alpha holding court among his intimates. She could not distinguish individual words. She didn't need to. She knew what tonight was. Tomorrow, the noble delegations would begin arriving for the moon ascension ceremony. 5 days of formalized ritual, the ceremony that reaffirmed the bonds between the Silver Fang Kingdom and its vassal packs. The ceremony at which, by the old laws still technically in force, the Luna stood beside her Alpha as co-authority, as equal voice, as the embodiment of the pack's female line. Darius had not told her what role she would play in this year's ceremony. He hadn't needed to. She already knew. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The thing about surviving inside an institution that is trying to erase you is that it requires a specific kind of discipline that has nothing to do with endurance. People assumed survival was about endurance, about being able to take it, to absorb the next humiliation and the next and the one after that without breaking. And endurance was part of it. She would not pretend otherwise. There were nights in the first 2 years where the weight of what this place was doing to her felt like something physical, like pressure on the chest, like slowly being pressed flat. But endurance alone was passive. Endurance alone was just waiting to be finished. What kept her functional, what kept her sharp, kept her watching, kept her tracking every shift in the court's dynamics, every document in a locked room, every name in an old field report, was something colder than endurance. It was patience with a purpose. She closed her eyes. She thought about the symbol she had found scratched into the stone of the south kitchen wall 6 weeks ago. Barely visible, half hidden behind a shelving unit. A small thing. 4 lines arranged in a specific pattern she would not have recognized 5 years ago, when she had still believed she was simply an orphaned girl from an unremarkable bloodline who had been chosen as alpha mate by some combination of political calculation and circumstance. She recognized it now. She had been finding them for 4 months, always in places she cleaned, places staff frequented, places a Luna might pass through without anyone paying particular attention. The kitchen wall, the corner of the east courtyard, the underside of the second-floor landing, and chalk that dissolved in water, left in a spot she would know to look because of a pattern in her own cleaning schedule that no one else would have mapped. Someone was leaving her messages, someone who knew the Emberwolf symbols, someone who knew her schedule, someone who had been in this palace long enough to understand how its sightlines and patrol patterns worked. She had not responded to any of them yet. She was still deciding whether responding was the right move, or whether responding too early would surface whatever operation this was before it was ready. She was good at waiting. The knock on her door came at the 4th hour before dawn. Selene was already awake. She had been awake for the better part of an hour, lying still, listening to the palace settle into its deepest quiet. She sat up, rewrapped her hands quickly, and said, "Come in." The woman who entered was one of the kitchen workers, 40s, broad-shouldered, a face seamed by work. Her name was Ada. She'd been in the palace for 11 years. She kept to herself, did her work without complaint, and had never once, in the 3 years Selene had been on the servant's level, done anything to suggest she was anything other than what she appeared to be. She closed the door behind her, did not sit, did not speak immediately. She looked at Selene with the assessing expression of someone completing a calculation that had been running for a long time. "The East Courtyard," Otto said. "Tomorrow night, after the second bell." Selene looked at her. "Who sent you?" "Someone who has been waiting longer than you have." "That's not an answer." "No," Otto agreed. "It's not." She reached into the front pocket of her apron and put something on the table. It was small. A flat piece of dark stone, polished smooth, with a single symbol carved into its face. Selene looked at it. She did not touch it. The symbol was one she knew from a specific context, from the books she had been given as a child, before she was fostered out, before she understood what those books meant. It was not one of the symbols she had been finding on the palace walls. It was older than those. It was a seal symbol, specific to one family, one line. Her line. "Tomorrow night," Selene said, "after the second bell." Otto opened the door, stopped, did not look back. "You should know. The delegation from the northern reaches is arriving early, day after tomorrow instead of 4 days out." "Why does that matter?" "Because their alpha has a question he wants answered before the ceremony, about the Eastern Highlands, about what happened there 22 years ago." A pause. "About whether the heir survived." She left. Selene sat very still for a long time after the door closed. Then she reached out and picked up the stone. The following day began the way most days began. Before light, in the kitchen, where she helped prepare the morning service for the upper levels of the palace, because 3 years ago, Darius had quietly removed her from the guest list for the morning meal, and no one had officially informed the kitchen, which meant she had simply started helping with the preparation, and no one had told her to stop. The kitchen at dawn was warm and loud and smelled like bread and rendered fat. She liked it. It was one of the few places in this palace where no one was performing anything. The cooks were just working, focused, precise in the way people get when they have a volume of task to accomplish and insufficient time. She worked beside a young woman named Pell, who was 17 and relentlessly cheerful and who talked constantly, which Selene found useful because it meant she could think while appearing to be simply listening. She was thinking about the Northern Reaches delegation, Alpha Cato Vairus. She knew him only by reputation and by 3 references in documents she'd found in the locked room. He appeared in the field report in a different capacity than Darius. He had been one of the pack leaders in the Eastern Highlands during the consolidation years, but in the report he was listed not as a participant in the operation, but as a dissenter, as one of the leaders who had refused to cooperate and had subsequently lost 2 of his border territories as a political consequence. He had been living with that consequence for 22 years, and he was arriving early, asking questions about the Eastern Highlands, asking whether the heir had survived. She cut the bread into even slices and thought about what that meant. The simplest interpretation, Varys had caught the same wind she had been catching. The symbols appearing on the palace walls were not, she was increasingly certain, a single person's work. They were too distributed, too knowledgeable about the palace's geography. There was a network. The network had been operating quietly for some time, and something in the last several months had accelerated whatever timeline it was operating on. The moon ascension ceremony was in 5 days. She thought about that, about why the ceremony specifically, about what the ceremony was. In its official form, a reaffirmation of Silverfang's authority over the vassal packs. About what it was in its older form, before Silverfang had consolidated, when the ceremony had been held under a different authority entirely. About what it would mean if that older authority suddenly had a face again. "Are you even listening?" She looked at Pell. "Sorry," Selene said. "What?" "I said the Alpha's in a mood this morning. One of the guards was talking about it. Something happened last night in the West Garden. He sent Mira to her rooms early." Pell lowered her voice, delighted with the gossip. "Apparently there was a letter, some kind of letter that came in through the midnight courier." Selene kept her face neutral. "Do you know what the letter said?" "No, just that he read it and went quiet." "You know how he gets when he goes quiet." Pell made a face. The kind of quiet that means somebody's going to catch it later. Selene nodded. She finished the bread slices and began arranging them on the serving trays. She thought, a letter through the midnight courier. The same night Atta had come to her door, she thought, whoever was running this network was not operating patiently anymore. They were moving. She did not see Darius until the afternoon. He found her, which meant he had looked for her, which meant something had shifted. In the ordinary course of their existence in the same palace, she passed through his orbit the way background passes through a frame, present, visible if you looked directly, but not something you looked at directly. He did not seek her out. He had not sought her out, in any meaningful way for 2 years. She was in the East Corridor. Different from the East Courtyard, just the corridor, cleaning the window ledges because a delivery of stone for one of Darius's ongoing construction projects had left dust over everything on the east side. When she heard his footsteps. She knew his footsteps. She had learned them the way you learned the sounds a dangerous animal made when it was moving in your direction. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from necessity. 5 years of sharing a structure with a person who could remove what remained of your position with a sentence had made her attentive to the acoustic signature of his approach. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at her. He was 31. He had the build of a man who had trained for war and not stopped, broad through the shoulder, heavy at the jaw, the kind of physical presence that most rooms reorganized themselves around. He was, objectively, what this kingdom had been built to produce. A dominant alpha at the peak of his authority, with 11 vassal packs, a standing army, and a continent-wide reputation for being the kind of problem that was better to not create. He was also, she had concluded some time ago, frightened. Not of her. He had never been frightened of her. That had been, she thought, his foundational error, the first crack in the architecture of his certainty. He was frightened of something else, something that had been getting closer for a while, and that the midnight letter had apparently confirmed. "Put that down," he said. She put down the cloth. "Walk with me." She walked. He took her through the east corridor and into the small anteroom off the east gallery, a room without windows, without regular foot traffic. She noted this. She noted the position of the door and whether it locked from the inside or the outside. From the outside. "The Northern Reaches delegation," he said, without preamble, the moment the door closed. "Varys is moving his arrival up." "I heard." His eyes sharpened. "From who?" "Kitchen talk. Early arrivals always circulate." He looked at her for a long moment. The look was the one she had the most practice receiving, the one that was trying to determine how much she knew and had not said. It was a look that worked on most people. It worked because most people, when subjected to the sustained attention of a dominant alpha, felt the pressure of it in their bones, felt the instinct to placate, to offer something, to fill the silence with whatever information might make the pressure stop. Selene let the silence run. "Varys is bringing questions about the Eastern Highlands," Darius said. "Old territory dispute?" "Don't do that." His voice dropped. "Don't perform ignorant at me, Selene. You've never been ignorant. That's one thing I can say about you." She looked at him. "What do you want me to say, Darius?" "I want to know if you've been in contact with anyone from outside this palace." "I clean the floors," she said. "I make the beds. I prepare the linens, and I help in the kitchen. I haven't left the palace walls in 8 months." "That's not what I asked." "Then ask what you mean." The air in the room was the specific quality of air in rooms where things were about to be said that could not be unsaid. She watched him feel the edge of it, watched him pull back. "The ceremony is in 5 days," he said. "I need it to go cleanly." "It will go cleanly." "There are people arriving who are going to be watching everything, the state of this court, the stability of my authority." He stopped, started again. "I need you visible at the ceremony. Beside me. Not as a servant." Selene said nothing. "As Luna, he said. "Properly presented. Whatever you need from the wardrobe. I'll have it arranged." She looked at him. She saw with perfect clarity what this was. The midnight letter had frightened him enough that he was recalculating his assets. He had decided, in the space of one night, that a Luna beside him was worth more right now than the current arrangement with Mira. He had not bothered to consider what 5 years of the current arrangement had cost. He did not think in those terms. What he thought in was utility, what served the moment, what shored up the structure, what prevented the thing that was approaching from arriving. "All right," she said. He blinked. He had expected more resistance. She could see it in the slight recalibration of his expression. He had come here ready for an argument, maybe ready to make it an order rather than a request, and she had simply agreed. "The ceremony preparation meetings start tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll have you included." "Fine. And Selene," he stopped her at the door. "Whatever you think you know about the Varys delegation, keep it inside these walls." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I always keep things inside these walls," she said. She left him standing in the windowless room. The east courtyard, after the second bell, was empty, or appeared to be. Selene crossed it in the dark without a lamp, moving along the outer wall where the torchlight from the upper windows didn't reach. The courtyard was a working space in daytime, deliveries, maintenance, the loading and unloading of the palace's endless material needs. At night it was just stone and shadow. She stopped at the far end, at the corner where the outer wall met the storage building. "You came alone," said a voice. The man who stepped out of the shadow of the storage building was not someone she recognized. He was somewhere in his 40s, lean, dressed in the rough clothing of a laborer. But the way he moved was wrong for a laborer. Too controlled, too deliberate, the specific economy of motion that belonged to people who had been trained to not occupy unnecessary space. "You left me symbols on palace walls," she said, "and sent a kitchen worker to my room. If I couldn't come alone, the symbols would have been wasted." He looked at her for a moment, then he half smiled, the kind of expression that contained something older than humor. "Your mother moved like you," he said. "That same way of walking, like the ground owed you nothing." She did not flinch. She had practiced not flinching at mentions of her family. "Who are you?" "My name is Wren. I served the Emberwolf line for 19 years. I was your mother's field commander for the last 4 of them." He paused. "I've been in this palace for 6 years. 6 years. She had arrived 5 years ago. "You were here before me," she said. "I was here to watch for you. We knew where you'd end up." The bonding arrangement with Silverfang had been in motion for years. It was part of what your mother was trying to prevent when... He stopped. "When the operation happened." The east courtyard was cold. Selene stood still and let the cold be cold. "How many?" she said. "In this palace, specifically?" 4. Across the vassal territories, considerably more. The network has been rebuilding quietly for 15 years. We were waiting for 2 things. The first was you, waiting until you were positioned, until you understood your situation well enough to be an asset rather than a risk. And the second? He reached into his coat, produced a document, folded, sealed, the seal already broken. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it. It was a letter, formal, in the administrative style of the Northern Reaches, addressed to Alpha King Darius Blackmoor and dated 3 days ago. She read it in the dim light from the upper windows, reading carefully, reading each sentence twice. By the time she reached the 3rd paragraph, she understood why Darius had gone quiet in the West Garden. The letter was a formal notice. It informed Darius that the Northern Reaches intended to raise, at the Moon Ascension ceremony, the question of the Emberwolf succession. It cited specific provisions of the Continental Pact Law, provisions old enough that most current Alpha Kings probably thought they were functionally extinct. It requested the presence of any living claimant to the Emberwolf bloodline. It had been co-signed by 4 other pack leaders, including 2 of Darius's supposed allies. "The second thing you were waiting for," Selene said, "was the moment when the question would have to be answered publicly," Wren said, "with enough witnesses that it couldn't be suppressed." She refolded the letter, handed it back. "He's going to try to move before the ceremony," she said. "Now that he knows this is coming, he's going to try to manage it before it becomes a public event." She thought about the anteroom, the windowless room, the request that she appear beside him. "He's already started. He's trying to figure out what I know." "Yes." And if he decides I'm a liability, we're aware of that risk. We have contingencies. Ren's voice was level. But the decision point is yours. This cannot proceed without your active participation. You would need to stand before those alpha delegations and make the claim yourself, in your own name. Whatever happens after that, I understand what happens after that, Selene said. She stood in the cold courtyard and looked at the wall of the palace. The stone was old under the newer additions. The old stone had been there long before Silverfang, long before Darius, long before everything that had been built on top of it. It had no particular loyalty to the current arrangement. Stone remembered nothing except pressure. She thought about 5 years of floors, 5 years of cold corridors and gray water and hands that split open in the winter and closed again because there was no option that didn't involve them closing. She thought about the field report on the desk in the locked room. She thought about her mother moving like the ground owed her nothing. She thought about Darius's face in the anteroom, the calculation behind his eyes. The way he had said Selene as if the word was a resource he was deciding whether to spend. The ceremony is in 5 days, she said. Yes. I need 2 things before then. She turned to look at Ren directly. The first is access to the document in the locked room on the 3rd floor. I need it verified by someone who can authenticate its chain of custody. Someone outside this palace. Someone Varys's delegation would accept as credible. Ren nodded slowly. The second? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not softer, but different, like something that had been held in place for a long time had shifted. Your mother asked for the same thing, he said, in a different context, but the same shape. Did she get it? Not in time. Selene looked at the stone wall. Then we make sure I have more time than she did. She turned to go back inside. Selene. She stopped. He knows something is moving, Ren said. He doesn't know what or who, but he is not going to let this ceremony happen without trying to control every element of it. If he identifies you as the threat before the 5th day, he already suspects I know something, she said. That's not new. He suspected that for a long time. She paused. The difference is, he also needs me right now. He told me tonight he wants me visible at the ceremony, beside him. He's going to spend the next 4 days trying to keep me close enough to monitor and useful enough to display. She almost smiled. That works for us. She went back inside. She climbed the servant stairs to the 2nd floor, and then the internal stair to the 3rd, and she stood for a moment outside the locked room before she continued to her own floor. Tomorrow, the preparation meetings would begin. Tomorrow, she would sit beside Darius in a council room for the first time in 2 years, and the court would watch, and Mira would watch, and the arriving delegations would watch, and she would perform the role of a Luna who had been brought back in from the margins, compliant, grateful, no threat. She was very good at performance. 5 days. She continued up the stairs. Behind her, on the 3rd floor landing, the door to the locked room opened. She heard it, stopped, did not turn around. Footsteps. One person. Moving without a lamp, she would have seen the light. The footsteps stopped directly behind her. I thought you'd want to know, said a voice she had never heard before. A woman's voice, low and clipped, the accent of the northeastern territories. The document in that room isn't the only copy. Selene turned. The woman was young, younger than she'd expected from the voice, mid-20s, dressed as a court attendant in the wine-colored uniform of Mira Holden's personal staff. Mira Holden's personal staff. There's a 2nd copy, the woman said. Darius has it. He's kept it for 22 years. He keeps it. She paused, something complicated moving across her face. Because he looks at it. Because he looks at it, and he thinks it proves he's protected, that what he did is buried. Selene looked at her. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been in Mira's rooms for 3 years, the woman said, and last month she found out something about where Mira's family got its money. Her jaw tightened. And now I need him to not be protected anymore. The corridor was silent except for the draft. Selene looked at this woman, the stranger in a rival's uniform with a voice full of something old and not yet resolved. and made a calculation that took approximately 3 seconds. "What's your name?" she said. "Calla." "All right, Calla." She kept her voice even. "You said he keeps the document. Where?" Calla told her. It was not the answer Selene had expected. It was the answer that changed everything. Because the document was not in a locked room, not in a vault, not in any of the secure locations a careful man would use to store something he believed protected him. It was somewhere that made a specific and terrible kind of sense. Somewhere that revealed, in the way that true things revealed themselves, exactly what Darius Blackmoor believed about his own invulnerability. He had kept it in the Luna's chambers, in the room that had been Selene's, that had been taken from her, that was now Mira Holden's. He had kept it in a room he believed she could never enter again. The Luna's chambers were on the second floor, east wing, behind a door Selene had not passed through in 3 years. She stood in the corridor outside her own room and thought about that. Not with bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury that cost more than it returned, and she had learned to spend carefully. She thought about it the way she thought about most things in this palace, as a problem with a specific geometry, with angles that either worked for her or didn't, and her job was to find the ones that did. The problem in front of her was this. The document was in that room. Calla had told her where, not precisely, but close enough. Behind the vanity mirror, in the wall cavity that the original construction had left when they'd moved the fireplace flue. Selene knew about the cavity. She had found it herself, in the first year, before any of this, when she had still believed this was her room and she was its legitimate occupant, and the small hidden spaces in its walls were hers to discover. She had put nothing there. She had not known then that she would need a hiding place. Darius had apparently known differently. Calla was 3 steps behind her, close enough that Selene could hear her breathing, controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone managing fear rather than not feeling it. That was useful information. Fear that was being managed was fear that could be directed. Fear that was not being managed was a liability. "Mira's schedule," Selene said quietly. "She takes her evening meal in the upper sitting room, doesn't return to the chambers until the 9th bell, usually later." Calla paused. "Tonight she was with the Alpha until he sent her away. She went to the upper sitting room. She was upset. Upset enough to break her routine?" A beat. "I don't think so. When she's upset, she goes to the sitting room and she drinks, and she holds very still, and she doesn't go back to the room until she can present correctly." Selene filed that. "Guards?" "1 rotation past the door every 40 minutes. They changed the pattern 3 months ago." "When did the pattern change?" Calla was quiet for a second. "Around when the symbols started appearing." Selene turned to look at her then. Calla met her eyes. Gray eyes. A little too alert for someone who was supposed to be palace staff. A little too steady. The wine-colored uniform fit her the way uniforms fit people who have worn several different ones. "How long have you actually been in Mira's service?" Selene said. "Long enough?" "That's not an answer." 8 months, Calla said. "I came in through a housekeeping placement. I have references. They're solid." "But you're not a housekeeper." "I'm whatever I need to be." She said it without apology. "Same as you, from what I can see." Selene held her gaze for another moment. Then she turned back to the door. She did not have a key to the Luna's chambers. That was the first practical obstacle. The lock had been changed when Mira moved in. She knew this because she had tried the original key once, in the 2nd year, in a moment of something she did not want to call grief, and found it didn't work. She had not tried again. But Calla reached past her and put a key in the lock. Selene looked at the key, looked at Calla. "She has 3 copies, Calla said. "The 3rd one she forgets about." The door opened. The room was warm. Someone had banked the fire properly before the evening service, and the heat had settled into the stone and was radiating back. It smelled like Mira's perfume, heavy, floral, the kind of scent that cost enough to make a statement. Selene breathed it in and registered it the way she registered most sensory information in this palace. As data, as context, as something to account for and move past. The room was different than she remembered. Different furniture. The bed had been replaced, the window drapes were heavier, there was a sitting area near the fireplace that had not existed before. The bones of the room were the same, the bones she knew. She crossed to the vanity. It was ornate. More ornate than anything Selene had chosen when this was her room. The mirror was large, framed in dark wood with carved detail. It sat against the east wall, which was correct. The east wall, the fireplace flue, the cavity the original builders had left. She ran her hand along the mirror's right edge, feeling for the point where the frame met the wall. The mirror was flush, no obvious gap, no visible seam. She pressed. Nothing. She pressed higher. Nothing. She crouched and pressed at the lower right corner, and the wall gave slightly. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, just enough to feel the resistance of something that could move and had not moved in a while. "There'll be a mechanism," Calla said from behind her. "They usually—" "I know how hidden panels work," Selene said, not sharply, evenly. She was running her fingers along the baseboard now, along the seam between the wall and the floor. There. A small depression in the stone. She pressed it. The panel, not the mirror, just the wall section beside it, a foot wide and 2 feet tall, came loose. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way things opened when they had been designed to be unobtrusive. She caught it before it swung out too far and eased it to a controlled angle. The cavity was shallow, brick-lined, cold compared to the room around it. There was a box inside, metal, small, the kind of lockbox that suggested significance without requiring display. And on top of the box, not locked away, just resting there as though whoever had placed it here trusted completely in the security of the hidden space. A folder. Leather-wrapped. Old. She took the folder. She opened it without moving from her crouch beside the open panel. The document inside was a copy, as Calla had said. Same format as the one in the locked room on the 3rd floor. Same administrative style, same date, same operational headings. But there were differences. This copy had annotations in the margins. Handwritten. She recognized the handwriting. She had seen it on palace documents, on orders, on correspondence that had crossed her desk in the first year when she'd still been allowed a desk. Darius's handwriting. The annotations were not admissions, they were not confessions. They were the notations of a man tracking an operation's logistics, timing adjustments, personnel notes, a line here and there that indicated which elements had proceeded according to plan. But there was one annotation that was not logistical. At the bottom of the 3rd page, beside the section that documented the status of the Emberwolf royal family's surviving members, beside a notation that had been redacted in the official version she'd found upstairs, replaced with a black line, in Darius's handwriting, in ink that had gone brown with age. Child placed west, too young. Threat status, monitor. She read it twice. She placed it back in the folder. She was 24 years old. She had been 7 when the operation happened. She had been placed west with a distant relative separated from her family. He had known. Not just known that the operation happened, known she existed, known where she was, had made a decision, child, too young, not an immediate threat, and had filed it and moved forward, and eventually, she had become useful as a political match. And he had married her and installed her as Luna and spent 5 years slowly stripping her down while knowing, the entire time, what she was. Calla said something. Selene didn't hear it. She was looking at the annotation and breathing. The thing that moved through her then was not rage. Rage was loud, and loud was wasteful, and she had burned through whatever loud response this information could have produced sometime in the long months since she'd started finding documents and started understanding the shape of what had been done. What moved through her now was quieter and heavier and more load-bearing. The specific kind of clarity that happened when the last piece of something settled into place and the full structure of it became visible. She knew, now, exactly what she was working with. She closed the folder. "We need to leave this here," she said. Calla blinked. "The document has to stay where it is." She fitted the folder back on top of the box, eased the panel closed. If it disappears, he knows immediately. If it stays where it is, he doesn't know I've seen it. She stood, checked the mirror's position, adjusted it by a fraction. He's going to spend the next 4 days thinking I know less than I do. That's valuable. That's more valuable than having the document in my possession. But if you need to present it at the ceremony, Calla, She turned. Who else knows you came to me tonight? A pause. Ren. And Ren knows what you told me? He doesn't know about the second document. He knew I had information about Mira's household, and he told me to use my judgment about when and who. Selene looked at her. Why did you choose tonight? Specifically. Something moved through Kala's face. Something that was not quite hesitation, but was adjacent to it. Because of what I heard this afternoon, before Mira went to the upper sitting room. Tell me. She had a meeting, Mira, in the chambers, which she doesn't usually do. She keeps her business in the sitting room, keeps the sleeping room separate. But today she brought someone in, one of the court advisors. I was in the adjoining room, the dressing room. She didn't know I was there. Selene waited. They were talking about you, Kala said. Specifically, what to do about you being included in the ceremony preparations. Mira found out she has someone on the Alpha's household staff. She found out within an hour of you agreeing to appear beside him. And? The advisor told her not to worry about it. Told her the appearance would be managed. Kala's voice stayed flat, but her jaw was tight. He said they'd been managing the Luna situation for 5 years and 4 more days wasn't a problem. What does managed mean in this context? Kala met her eyes. He said there were medical options, that if the Luna presented as unwell before the ceremony, no one would question her absence. The fire in the grate shifted. A log dropped. The room was warm and smelled like Mira's perfume. Selene stood with that information for about 3 seconds. Then she said, Which advisor? Crew. Lord Advisor Crew. She knew the name, knew the face, a man in his 60s, careful, the kind of careful that came from a long career of attaching himself to authority and making himself useful enough to survive the transitions. He had been on the court before Darius consolidated, had been there under Darius's father, had survived, was still here. Was also, she now recollected, named in the field report on the 3rd floor, not as a commander, as a liaison. When was this conversation? She said. 2 hours ago. 2 hours ago. Before the West Garden. Before Darius sent Mira away. Before the silence that Pell had described this morning. This morning, which was already yesterday, the clock had crossed midnight. She calculated the sequence. Darius and Mira had been together in the West Garden. The letter from the northern reaches had arrived. He had gone quiet. He had sent Mira away. And before any of that, before the letter even arrived, Mira had already been meeting with Crew about medical options. The letter had frightened Darius, but someone had already been planning before the letter. Someone had seen this coming before Darius had. All right, Selene said. She moved toward the door. You need to go back to Mira's rooms before she returns. What are you going to do? Tonight? Sleep. She said it without irony. I need 4 days to run correctly. That starts with not being too tired to think. Kala looked at her with an expression that Selene had seen before on faces in this palace. The specific look of someone recalibrating what they were dealing with. Deciding whether what they were seeing was calm or coldness, or something that didn't have a simple name. The ceremony? Kala said. What happens at the ceremony? A lot of things are going to happen at the ceremony, Selene said. Make sure you're positioned somewhere you can see the main floor. Mant. She did not sleep. She lay in her room on the servant's level with her hands wrapped and her eyes on the ceiling, and she did not sleep, but she did something that served the same function. She ran through everything she knew in a sequence, ordered it, stress-tested it, looked for the points where it could break. The network was moving. Ren was in the palace. Kala was in Mira's household. The Northern Reaches delegation was arriving early with co-signatories from 4 other packs in a formal request to surface the Ember Wolf succession question. She had the location of the annotated document. She had Darius's own handwriting placing himself in the operation's decisions, not ordering the massacre directly, but tracking the status of the heir as a threat to be monitored. She had a court advisor who was already discussing medical options. What she did not have? Time margin. 4 days was not much time margin. What she did not have? Certainty about how many people in the arriving delegations were genuinely aligned versus opportunistically aligned. The co-signatories on Varys's letter had their own motivations. Some of those motivations would align with her, some would not. All of them would be watching to see whether the claimed heir was actually someone worth supporting, or whether this was a political play that would collapse on its own. She thought, the only thing that matters at the ceremony, the only thing that cannot be managed or medically removed or administratively neutralized, is the moment itself, the public moment. Every alpha and every noble in that room, at one time, with the question on the table. She thought, Darius knows something is coming. He does not know it's her. He suspects, but suspicion is not certainty, and he is still calculating her as an asset, a Luna to display, a symbol of stability, a managed element of the ceremony. She needed him to keep thinking that for 4 more days, which meant tomorrow morning, in the preparation meeting, she would sit beside him at the council table, and she would be exactly what he expected. Quiet, compliant, the Luna who had been brought back in from the margins and was grateful for it. She had done harder things. The preparation meeting convened in the council chamber at the first hour after dawn. Selene arrived precisely on time, not early, which would signal anxiety, not late, which would signal defiance. She was dressed appropriately for the first time in years, having gone to the palace wardrobe herself at first light and selected without drama. Dark green, fitted, the cut of a woman who had authority without needing to display it. Her hands were gloved to the wrist. Her hair was arranged. She had slept approximately 2 hours. The council chamber was already occupied when she entered. 8 people at the table, Lord Advisor Crew at the far end, 3 court officials she recognized, 2 she didn't, and a woman she identified after a moment as the head of the ceremony coordination staff. And Darius, at the table's head, already in conversation with Crew, his voice low, his posture carrying the specific quality of a man who had not slept either. He looked up when she entered. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the anteroom, the assessing look, the calculation running behind his eyes. But there was something else in it this morning, something that was not quite relief but was in the same territory. She had come. She was dressed correctly. She was going to play the role. Luna Selene, he said. He said it loud enough that everyone at the table heard. The deliberateness of it was not subtle, but it didn't need to be subtle. It just needed to reestablish the nomenclature. Luna Selene, in the council chamber, at the table. She inclined her head, sat in the chair that had been placed, she noted, to his left. His left, not his right. His right was occupied by Crew. She sat. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at Crew once. He looked back at her with the professional blankness of a man who had spent decades making sure his face gave nothing away. She looked away first, deliberately, giving him nothing to read into. The meeting began. It was a logistical meeting, ceremony staging, delegation accommodation assignments, the formal schedule of the 5 ceremony days, the processional order. She listened. She contributed twice, both times on protocol questions where her input was technically correct and entirely unremarkable. She watched Crew manage Darius's attention the way a practiced handler managed an instrument, subtle adjustments, gentle redirections, the specific skill of someone who had been doing it for decades, and did it so smoothly it looked like the natural flow of conversation. She was watching Crew manage Darius when she saw it. A courier came in at the meeting's 3rd hour. Private message, folded and sealed, handed to Crew rather than Darius. Crew read it. His face did not change. He folded it. He waited until the current agenda item concluded. Then he leaned and spoke briefly in Darius's ear. Darius straightened. His hand, flat on the table, pressed down briefly. The gesture of a man absorbing something he did not want to absorb. "We'll take a short recess," Darius said. Everyone filed out. Selene rose with the others. She was almost to the door. "Selene, stay." She stopped, turned. The room emptied. Crew remained. Darius was still at the table's head, his hand still flat on the surface, looking at something that wasn't in the room. "Varys isn't coming alone," Darius said. "Who else?" "Delaker and Tanis." He said the names without emphasis, but she heard what they meant. Delaker was the pack leader of the coastal reaches, not a co-signatory on the letter she had read in the courtyard, but a significant name. Tanis was smaller, eastern territories, but his pack sat directly on the land that had been the Emberwolf heartland. 7 packs. Between Varys's confirmed allies and these two additional arrivals, 7 packs coming in with coordinated timing and questions about the Eastern Highlands. "It's a show of force," Crew said. His voice was even, informational. Without being a declaration, they want the question surfaced publicly without having to be the ones who created the confrontation. "I know what it is," Darius said. "I know what it is." He looked at Selene then, directly, the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. "What do you know about the Ember Wolf succession question?" The room was very still. She let the question sit for one breath. 2. "What everyone knows," she said. "That the bloodline was broken in the consolidation wars, that there are periodically claims made by distant relatives, that Silverfang has consistently rejected those claims as insufficiently documented." "What everyone knows," he repeated, not agreeing, testing the echo of it. "I've been cleaning your floors for 5 years, Darius." She kept her voice level, flat. "Where would I have gotten different information?" Something moved through his face. She watched it move, watched him process the question, consider the answer, decide whether it satisfied him. He was not a stupid man. She had never made the mistake of thinking he was stupid. He was smart enough to have built an empire on a lie and kept it standing for 22 years. Smart enough to know that the woman in front of him had survived 5 years of systematic erasure without breaking, and that the people who survived things like that tended to have done so for reasons. But he also needed her to be manageable. He needed her to be a displayable Luna for 4 more days. He needed that badly enough to choose to believe her. "The ceremony preparations proceed as planned," he said. He said it to Crew, not to her. Then to her, "You'll need to be briefed on the processional protocol by this afternoon." "I'll find the coordinator," she said. She left. In the corridor, she walked at a measured pace toward the east wing. She did not think about what she had just done. She had just lied, directly, to an Alpha King who had her documents in a cavity behind a mirror, and her name in a field report as a monitored threat. She had looked him in the eye and performed ignorance, and he had chosen to accept the performance because the alternative was too complicated to manage in the time he had. She had 4 days. She turned the corner of the east corridor and nearly walked into Mira Holden. They had not spoken since the corridor the previous evening. Mira looked like she had not slept and was furious about it. Her face was composed, but there were shadows under her eyes that no amount of preparation had fully addressed, and the set of her mouth had the particular tightness of a woman operating under threat. They stood 2 feet apart in the corridor. "You're going to embarrass yourself," Mira said, quiet, not loud enough to carry. Standing beside him at the ceremony, "You think it means something. It doesn't. It means he needed something from you for 4 days." "I know exactly what it means," Selene said. "Then you know it ends the moment the ceremony is done." "I know what ends and what doesn't." She looked at Mira, looked at her carefully, the way she looked at everything carefully. "Mira, what did Crew promise you exactly when you went to him yesterday?" Mira went very still. "Because whatever he promised you," Selene said, "you should think about what he's promised other people in this palace over the years, and whether they're still here." She walked past her. Behind her, Mira did not move. Selene walked to the end of the corridor and took the servant stairs to the lower level and did not stop moving until she reached the east courtyard door. She opened it. Cold air came in. Ren was not there. She had not expected Ren to be there in daylight, but there was a mark on the stone beside the door. New, made in the night, the same symbol from the other places. Except this one had a number beside it. 3. 3. Not 4. Not 5. 3 days. Someone had moved the timeline. Her mind ran the calculation in the space of 1 breath. 3 days meant the ceremony was no longer the intended moment. 3 days meant something was happening on the 3rd day. Something was arriving, or something was being revealed, or someone had moved up a piece of the plan that she had not been told about. She stood in the cold with her hand on the door frame and understood, with the absolute precision of someone who had just run out of the one thing she'd been counting on, that she was no longer moving parallel to this plan. She was inside it, and the door she had just come through, the council chamber, the meeting, Darius's eyes across the table, The lie she'd told him cleanly and completely. That door was not behind her anymore. It was gone. 3 days. Selene stood in the cold mouth of the east courtyard door and let that number rewrite everything she thought she had. The plan as she had understood it was built around the ceremony. 5 days out, the public moment. Every alpha and noble in the room, the question surfaced before an audience large enough that suppressing it would cost more than answering it. That architecture had given her 4 days to move carefully. 4 days to maintain her performance in the council chamber, to stay close to Darius without triggering his suspicion past the point he was willing to manage, to let Ren's network complete whatever pieces were still in motion. 3 days collapsed that margin to almost nothing. She closed the courtyard door, stood in the interior corridor and breathed once, slowly, through her nose. Someone in the network had information she didn't. Someone had reason to believe the 4th day was no longer safe. That waiting for the ceremony meant not making it to the ceremony, which meant the threat from Crew was further along than Kala's account had suggested, or there was a second threat she had not yet identified, or someone in the network itself had broken containment and the information had moved in a direction that required acceleration. Any of those 3 possibilities changed her position significantly. The first was manageable. The second was manageable if she could identify it fast enough. The third was the one that kept her standing in the corridor instead of moving, because the third meant the network had a fracture in it, and a fractured network was not a resource. It was a liability that happened to be pointing in the same direction she was. She needed to find Ren. Not tonight. Tonight she needed to be exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, because Crew's eyes were on her and she had felt them in the council chamber. That specific quality of attention that came from someone who was watching for a sign that their timeline needed adjustment. She would not give him that sign. She went to bed. She slept 3 hours. When she woke, the palace was already moving. The first of the delegations arrived before noon. The Northern Reaches contingent came through the main gates with 20 riders and a standard that Selene recognized from the old maps in the locked room. Varys ran his pack under the colors of the Highland passes, gray and iron black, spare in the way that northern territories tended to be spare. No decorative excess, everything load-bearing. She watched their arrival from the East Gallery window. She was not supposed to be at the formal reception. Crew had managed the protocol assignment so that the ceremony coordinator would represent the palace at the gates while Darius conducted his private greeting in the receiving hall. Selene's name appeared nowhere in the afternoon's formal schedule. She watched anyway. Cato Varys was older than she'd expected from the administrative profile she'd constructed of him. Late 50s, heavy through the chest, the kind of man whose size had nothing to do with display. He moved through the gate with the unhurried quality of someone who had decided before he left home exactly what he was here to do and was not anxious about doing it. His riders arranged themselves with practiced efficiency, no wasted motion anywhere in the contingent. She noted who rode beside him, an aide, young, taking notes. An older woman she did not recognize, and a man in the 3rd rank who wore the same colors but whose bearing was different from the others, who scanned the palace facade with the systematic attention of someone conducting an assessment rather than an observation. She did not recognize him. She filed him. Ren found her at the 2nd hour past noon in the linen storage room on the 2nd floor, where she was doing exactly what her schedule said she should be doing, preparing the guest room supplies for the incoming delegations. He appeared in the doorway the way he had been appearing in places for 6 years, without announcement, without any prior indication that he was coming, just suddenly present. "The mark," she said, without looking up from the linen she was folding. 3 days. Who moved it and why? He came in, closed the door. "Petra?" he said. She did not recognize the name. "Who is Petra?" "She was our contact in Crew's household. Has been for 4 years. He paused. "She came to me last night. Told me that Crew met with the palace physician the morning before yesterday. Private meeting, no staff present. The physician's supply inventory was conducted yesterday afternoon. A full inventory, which they only do when something has been ordered that needs documentation. The cold in the room was different from the cold outside. It was the specific temperature of understanding something you had hoped not to understand. "What was ordered?" Selene said. She doesn't know the specific compound. She knows the physician requisitioned 3 items from the locked pharmacopoeia. She knows one of them has a delayed onset. Delayed onset. She set down the linens. How delayed? 2 to 4 days, depending on dosage and administration method, which means if it was administered in the last 48 hours, he did not finish the sentence. She finished it herself, internally, without expression. If it was administered in the last 48 hours, the ceremony on day 5 was already too late. The ceremony on day 5 would happen to a Luna who was, by then, presenting as gravely ill, or not presenting at all. "The preparation meeting yesterday morning," she said. "There was tea service." Wren looked at her. "I didn't drink it," she said. "I don't drink things I haven't watched poured in this palace. That's been true for 2 years. She picked the linens back up. Her hands were steady. She noted that they were steady and filed that away too. Useful, that steadiness. Necessary to maintain. "But they don't know I didn't drink it. Crew thinks the administration window has already passed. Which means he's not watching for me to take countermeasures. He's watching for me to start presenting symptoms." She looked at Wren. 3 days. The ceremony is in 3 days now, not 5. Tell me that's achievable. The delegations are arriving ahead of schedule. Varys's early arrival pulled 2 others forward. If we convene the primary witnesses on day 3 instead of day 5, we lose the full formal ceremony as the venue, but we gain the element of timing, she said. Crew doesn't expect anything until day 5. If it happens on day 3, he has no contingency in place. That's the calculation. Where's the authenticated copy of the field report? The 3rd floor document. You were going to have it verified. It left the palace 6 days ago. The verification contact is with Varys's delegation. He paused. The man in the 3rd rank of their arrival contingent. The man she had noted at the gate. The one with the systematic scan of the facade. He has the authenticated chain of custody? He is the chain of custody. He was a records clerk in the Eastern Highlands Administrative Office 22 years ago. He witnessed the original document's filing. He can testify to its authenticity and to the specific signatures on the operational orders. She stood with that for a moment, the completeness of it, the way it had been assembled over years, piece by piece, while she had been cleaning floors and wringing out gray water and sleeping in a room with a narrow window. She had thought she was waiting. She had thought patience was the instrument. It had not been patience. It had been this network, running parallel to her survival, building the case while she built herself back together inside the institution that had taken everything. 2 structures growing in the same dark, neither knowing the full shape of the other until now. "Tonight," she said. "I need to meet Varys tonight." "That's complicated. He's in the formal guest wing. Guards. Calla can get me into the guest wing. She has access that doesn't look like access." She began moving toward the door. "Set it up through her. 2nd bell, same as before." "Selene," his voice stopped her. "There's something else, from Petra." She turned. His face had changed. The professional evenness was still there, but something beneath it had shifted, the kind of shift that happened in people who were about to deliver information they had been hoping would turn out to be wrong. "The 2nd co-signatory on Varys's letter," he said, "Pack Leader Aldrin of the Western Passes." She knew the name. "He's one of the 4 packs aligned with Varys's formal notice. He arrived this morning, separately from Varys through the South Gate. Private arrival. He met with crew at the 10th hour. The room was quiet. "For how long?" she said. "An hour and a half." An hour and a half. A co-signatory on a letter demanding the surfacing of the Emberwolf succession question. Meeting privately with the man who had ordered a delayed onset compound from the palace pharmacopoeia for an hour and a half, on the day the delegations arrived. She thought about structures, about the way an empire built on lies maintained itself, not through a single pillar of deception, but through a distributed network of accommodations, of people who had made decisions they needed to not have examined, of alliances built on shared culpability. Aldrin's pack sat in the Western Passes. She had been placed west as a child. Someone had moved her before the operation. She had assumed for months that someone had been a loyalist, someone acting in her family's interest. She looked at Ren. Did Aldrin know where I was placed? Ren's jaw tightened. Petra doesn't know what was said in the meeting. That wasn't what I asked. A long pause. The fostering arrangement, Ren said slowly, was coordinated through the Western Passes Administrative Network. Aldrin's predecessor, his father, oversaw the regional placement office at the time. He stopped. We always assumed it was a loyalist acting without Aldrin's father's knowledge. But you're not sure? No. She processed that. The fostering that had saved her life might have been arranged by the same network that was now co-signing formal notices and meeting with crew, which meant she had not been saved because someone valued her survival. She had been saved because someone had valued having a surviving heir as a future asset, a piece to play when the board reached a configuration where the piece was useful. 22 years of being someone's contingency plan. She breathed in once. Out. Pull Aldrin from the witness list, she said. Whatever we were planning to present at the convening, he's not in the room for it. If we exclude him, it signals, I know what it signals. Pull him anyway, and find out before tonight what he told crew. She opened the door. Everything else proceeds. She walked out into the corridor and moved toward the east stairs with the measured pace of a woman who was delivering linens. The afternoon was the hardest part. Not because anything dramatic happened, nothing dramatic happened. The afternoon was a succession of preparation tasks and protocol briefings and the ordinary machinery of a palace receiving a dozen delegations simultaneously. She moved through it correctly. She spoke to the ceremony coordinator about the processional. She confirmed accommodation arrangements for 3 separate household staff questions. She passed crew in the main corridor at the 4th hour and inclined her head exactly as she had always inclined her head to senior court advisors. He looked at her. She looked back. In the specific language of a palace corridor, what passed between them was nothing. A senior advisor acknowledging the Luna's presence, the Luna acknowledging his seniority. That was the surface. Beneath the surface, she was reading him. He was reading her. They were both doing it with the precision of people who had been doing it for years, and both doing it while maintaining the perfect appearance of 2 people who had nothing particularly interesting to say to each other. She saw, in the fraction of a second when his gaze moved across her face and checked something, that he was looking for the symptoms he expected. She did not look symptomatic. She looked like a woman who had not slept quite enough but was managing. He would read that as early onset, consistent with his timeline, not alarming. She let him read it that way. She continued to the east stairs. Darius was a man who had been waiting a long time, and people who had been waiting a long time had a quality about them that was different from impatience. Impatience was young. What Darius had was the particular stillness of someone who had extended their timeline so many times it no longer surprised them, who had learned to hold a position across years without it becoming bitterness, mostly because they had made the judgment that bitterness was a performance that cost energy and returned nothing. He looked at her across the narrow sitting room in the guest suite and said nothing for a moment. Just looked. Calla was at the door. The suite was quiet. His aide had been relocated to a different task by a message that Ren had arranged, and the corridor guard rotation had been managed by the 3rd member of the palace network she had not yet met, a man on the night guard staff named Fen, who appeared, according to Ren, to have been in position for 3 years specifically for a moment like this. You look like her, Varys said finally. The eyes are different, but the way you stand. She did not respond to that. It was not a question. The records clerk in your contingent. Marsh, Ren tells me. Eden Marsh. He's been with me for 11 years. He came north after the Eastern Highlands administrative restructuring, after what they called the restructuring. His voice was flat on those last words. Not emotional, factual in the way that things became factual after you had lived with their weight long enough. He has the documentation authenticated by 3 independent archivists, all of them outside Silverfang territory. Chain of custody is clean? From original filing to present, yes. She breathed. The convening is in 3 days, not 5. Can your contingent be ready? He did not react with surprise. He nodded once, as though he had been expecting this adjustment. The others, Tanis, Delaker, they'll need the updated timeline. Can you reach them without going through any channel crew monitors? I didn't come here through cruise channels. He looked at her steadily. I've been building clean channels in and out of this kingdom for 9 years. I know which ones Silverfang watches. 9 years. She looked at this man, this alpha who had lost territory 22 years ago, who had apparently spent the subsequent decades building something she was only now seeing the full shape of. She thought about the letter, the co-signatories, the formal notice. She thought about Aldrin. Aldrin met with crew today, she said. Varys's expression did not change, but something in the air of the room changed. For an hour and a half, she said. Private. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process it, watched him do the same calculation she had done, arrive at the same conclusions, or close enough. I wondered, he said quietly, when his name went on the letter. We didn't ask for it. He inserted himself. You didn't ask for it? No. He approached the Western Reaches contact 3 months ago and offered. Said he wanted to make right what his father had been part of. Said the fostering arrangement had always weighed on him. Knowing it was his family's network that had moved you, knowing what the alternative would have been. She looked at him. Did you believe him? A long pause. I believed him enough to let his name stay on the letter. I didn't give him any operational detail. Does he know about the convening on day 3? No. Does he know about Marsh? No. She let out a breath she had been holding more carefully than she'd realized. Then we're intact. For now. Varys leaned forward slightly, his hands on his knees, his posture carrying the weight of someone about to say something he had been turning over for a long time. Selene, you need to understand what happens at the convening, not strategically. I think you understand the strategy, but what it asks of you, physically, in that room, what it requires. Tell me. Every pack leader in attendance will be watching to see whether the claim is performative or real. They've seen political plays before. They've seen people produce documentation and make legal arguments. That's not what moves an alpha council. Documentation and legal arguments move courts, and we don't have a court. We have a room full of dominant wolves who are deciding whether to shift their loyalty based on whether they believe in what they're looking at. He met her eyes. What they need to see is the bloodline. Not proved, felt. There are people in that room who were alive 22 years ago who remember what the Ember Wolf Authority felt like before it was taken. And there are people who have heard about it their whole lives. Either way, what you produce in that room has to be something they recognize. She understood what he was saying. She had been understanding it, at some level, since she had found the first symbol on the kitchen wall and felt something old and pre-verbal shift in her chest. The Emberwolf bloodline was not simply a legal designation, it was a bloodline. It carried something, not magic in any simple sense, not power that announced itself with light and sound, but something that dominant wolves felt in the presence of legitimate authority, the same way they felt a pack bond or a territorial boundary, something that operated below cognition. She had been suppressing it for 5 years, suppressing it the way you suppressed a breath in a room where breathing might give you away. Deliberately, constantly, the suppression becoming so habitual she had almost forgotten it was a choice she was making. I know, she said. When you stop suppressing it, I know what happens, she said. I've known for a while. He looked at her. Then you know it can't be taken back. The moment it's out, every dominant wolf in the palace feels it, not just the delegations, everyone, including Darius. Yes. She thought about Darius's face in the anteroom, the calculation behind his eyes, the annotation in the margin of the field report, monitor. She thought about 5 years of gray water and split palms and the particular silence of a room that had stopped recognizing her. Then that's what the third day is, she said. Varys nodded slowly. That's what it is. She stood to leave. She was at the door when she heard the sound, not in the room from outside, in the corridor. A voice. Familiar cadence, familiar register. She would have known it in a burning building. Darius. In the guest wing corridor, moving toward this suite. She looked at Calla. Calla's face had gone bloodless. He doesn't come to the guest wing, Calla said, barely audible. He never comes to the guest wing. He sends crew. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Selene turned to Varys. He was already on his feet, his hand extended to indicate the adjoining room. His aide's room, empty, dark. She moved. 3 steps to the adjoining door, through it, pulled it to a half-inch gap. Through the gap, she heard the suite door open, heard Darius's footsteps enter. Alpha Varys. His voice. Even. Controlled. The voice he used when he was not controlled. A courtesy visit. I wanted to make sure your accommodations were suitable. They're adequate. Varys's voice carried the same weight it had in conversation with her. Unhurried, a man who had been waiting long enough that one more unexpected variable barely registered. The rooms are fine. Good. A pause. Footsteps moving through the room. She tracked them. Toward the window. Away from the adjoining door. I understand you've had a long ride. 2 days. The ceremony in 3 days. I hope the condensed timeline is workable for your delegation. 3 days. Darius had already adjusted the ceremony schedule. She processed that. The ceremony was now officially on day 3, which meant her convening timeline and the official ceremony were now the same day. She stood in the dark of the adjoining room and listened to Darius conduct a courtesy visit that was not a courtesy visit, that was an assessment, that was a dominant alpha walking the perimeter of a threat he could feel but not yet locate. She listened to Varys respond to him with the measured courtesy of a man who had been preparing for this exact conversation for 9 years, and she stood in the dark and understood what the next 3 days actually were. Not preparation, not positioning, not patience with a purpose. The door was gone. The plan she'd had when she read the symbol on the courtyard wall was gone. The margin she'd built around the ceremony was gone. What remained was 3 days in a palace where the physician had been to the locked pharmacopoeia, where Aldrin had sat with crew for 90 minutes, where the man she'd lied to in a council chamber was now standing 15 feet away in the dark, looking for the shape of something he didn't yet have a name for. 3 days to stop being the woman who survived by being invisible. 3 days to become something this palace had never seen from her. Through the door, she heard Darius say very quietly, almost as an aside, I trust the Luna has been a suitable representative of the palace. A pause. I haven't seen much of her, Varys said. No, Darius said. You wouldn't have. She heard it in his voice. Not certainty. Something worse than certainty. The specific tone of a man who had just checked a box, confirmed a suspicion, completed a calculation. She heard him move toward the suite door, heard it open, heard him leave. She waited until his footsteps were gone from the corridor. Then she pushed the adjoining door open and looked at Varys. He looked back at her. He knows, he said. Not everything, she said. But enough. She looked at Calla. Calla's face was still pale, but her jaw was set. The look of someone who had decided something. 3 days, Selene said, is now 3 days with Darius actively moving against us. She stood in the warm guest suite with the cold still in her bones from the courtyard and looked at the 2 people in the room with her and made a decision that she felt the weight of in her chest. Not dread, not the compressed weight of 5 years of suppression, but something that had been living underneath all of that, something that had been waiting with considerably more patience than she had. We don't wait for him to move first, she said. Her voice came out different than she intended. Not louder, not harder, but with something underneath it that she had not let out in 5 years. Something that moved through the room the way cold air moved through a gap in stone. Not violent, but impossible to stop, finding every space available and filling it. Calla made a small sound. Not alarm. Something else. Varys straightened, not because he chose to, because something in him responded before he could decide not to. Selene noticed, filed it, understood what it meant. 3 days, she said. We end this on our terms. She moved before the guest suite door finished closing behind her. Not running. Running was panic, and panic was information she refused to give the corridor. She walked at the pace of a woman with somewhere specific to be, which she was, and she let Calla match her stride and did not speak until they had cleared the guest wing and turned into the service passage that ran parallel to the main east corridor. Fen, she said. Night rotation starts at the 8th bell, Calla said. Get him before the rotation. I need to know where Darius goes in the next 2 hours. Every room, every person he speaks to. If crew comes to him, I need to know within 10 minutes. She stopped at the passage junction. Can Fen do that? Yes? Then go. Calla went. Selene stood at the passage junction for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of complete stillness while she ran the variables. Darius had come to the guest wing himself. Not crew, not an aide. Himself, which meant he had not trusted the information he wanted to collect to anyone else. He had walked in on Varys' suite looking for something specific, and when Varys had told him he hadn't seen much of the Luna, Darius had confirmed whatever he was checking. He was not checking whether she was in the suite. He was checking whether she was where she was supposed to be. In her room, resting, presenting the early symptoms of a gradual illness that was supposed to be rendering her manageable, and Varys had just told him no. Which meant Darius now knew the compound had not been administered successfully, which meant crew's medical timeline was blown, which meant they would move to the secondary option faster than crew had planned, and the secondary option would not involve a gradual illness. It would involve something immediate and significantly less subtle. She had hours, maybe fewer. She stopped thinking about hours and started moving. Ren was in the east courtyard when she pushed the door open, not waiting by the wall, actively moving toward the building, which told her he already knew something had shifted. Darius went to the guest wing, he said. I was there. She kept her voice level. The compound wasn't administered. He knows it. Crew will move to a direct action before morning. Ren's jaw tightened. Then we pull the timeline forward. Tonight. Can we convene tonight? Not the full convening. Tanis and DeLaker aren't briefed on the Day 3 adjustment yet, and Marsh needs time to prepare the documentation presentation. We can't do the full convening tonight. He looked at her steadily. But we can do the one thing tonight that makes the convening impossible to stop. She understood what he meant before he finished saying it. If you produce before the delegations arrive at the formal convening, he said, if even 3 pack leaders witness it tonight, Varys, Tanis, one other, the question of authentication becomes secondary. The documentation supports it, but what they feel in that room is the primary evidence. You can't forge that. No one in the history of this continent has forged that. She looked at the courtyard wall. Old stone. Pre-Silverfang stone, under everything newer. She had been suppressing it for 5 years. She had suppressed it so consistently that it had become part of her architecture. The breath she always held, the weight she always carried, the thing she moved around in every room she entered the way you moved around a piece of furniture you had stopped seeing. 5 years ago, she had suppressed it because exposure meant death. In a palace that had just installed her as Luna without knowing what she was. With Darius still consolidating his eastern territories and suspicious of anything that might complicate the consolidation, with no network in place, no witnesses, no documentation, no structure to catch her if she fell, exposure would have been suicide. She had survived instead. She had cleaned the floors and carried the linens and drunk only water she had poured herself and kept her eyes down and her voice quiet, and she had survived every single day of 5 years and built, in the process, a picture of everything that had been done, and everyone who had done it, and every document that could prove it. Survival had been the instrument. This was what the instrument had been building toward. Who else besides Varys? She said. Marsh. He's part of the Reach's contingent. He has authority to witness for documentation purposes. And there's a woman in the Northern Reach's party. Older. She was a court witness in the Eastern Highlands before the consolidation. She was there, Selene. She knows what it feels like. The woman she had noted at the gate. Older, gray-haired, the one whose role she hadn't been able to place. Can you get them to the Undercroft? She said. The Undercroft was the old storage level under the palace's original section. Pre-Silverfang construction, no guards, accessible through the east kitchen passage. 20 minutes. 30, she said. I need to do something first. She did not tell him what. She went back inside. She went to her room on the servants' level, and she sat on the edge of the bed and she put her unwrapped hands flat on her thighs and she breathed. The thing she had been suppressing was not power in the way this kingdom understood power. It was not a weapon, not a force she could direct. It was more like gravity, like a field of pressure that existed around her at all times, and that she had been actively, continuously counteracting for 5 years. Letting it go was not a matter of doing something. It was a matter of stopping. She thought about her mother. She did not have many memories that she could trust as accurate. She had been 7, and 7-year-old memory was reconstructive, selective. But she had one that she had returned to repeatedly over the years, standing in a room with her mother, and the room being different because her mother was in it. Not because of anything visible, not because of anything her mother said or did, just because of what she was and what that radiated into the space around her. She had thought, as a child, that this was something all adults had. She had learned otherwise. She closed her eyes. She stopped counteracting. It happened the way exhaling happened after you had been holding your breath for a very long time. Not dramatic, not sudden, but immediately and completely felt. The pressure in her chest redistributed. The weight she had been carrying without naming it as weight shifted and settled differently. The room changed in the way her mother's room had changed. She sat with it for 1 minute. Just sat with it, getting used to the fact of it, the way you got used to standing up after a long time on the ground. Then she stood. She went to the undercroft. Varys was there. Marsh, thin man, 60s, with the careful hands of someone who had spent a lifetime handling documents he knew mattered. And the older woman, who looked at Selene when she came through the passage door and went very still, the way a person went still when they recognized something they had not expected to see again. "My name is Henna," the woman said. "I served the Emberwolf court for 14 years. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "I was 17 when the operation happened." Selene looked at her. "You know what you're looking at." "Yes." A pause. "We all do, now." She looked at Varys. He had the expression of a man who had been holding a calculated risk for 9 years and had just watched it resolve. "The convening," she said. "Day 3, the main hall." "The Alpha will try to prevent it," Varys said. "Let him try." She heard her own voice, and it was not the voice she had been using for 5 years. It was something older, something that did not ask for the room's attention. It simply had it, the way weather had it, the way the moment before a storm had it. "Document everything in this room tonight. Marsh, whatever you need from the witnesses, get it now." Marsh was already writing. His hands moved steadily with the confidence of a man doing the one specific thing he had been waiting a very long time to do. "Henna," Selene said, "I need you at the convening." "I'll be there," Henna said. She looked at Selene with the particular expression of someone seeing a face they had been looking for in other faces for 22 years. "Your mother would have walked into that room the same way." Selene let that land, did not deflect it, did not let it break her open either, because breaking open was not what the next 24 hours required. "Good," she said. "Then she taught us both something useful." She did not sleep. By the 4th hour, she was in the East Kitchen passage with Fenn's report from Calla. Darius had met with crew at the 9th bell, 1 hour after the guest wing visit, for 40 minutes. Then crew had met with 2 of the palace guard commanders. Not the full guard. 2 specific commanders. The ones who controlled the main hall access and the outer gate. She sat with that information and understood what it meant. Darius was not moving to arrest her. Not yet. Arrest was messy. It created a scene. It gave the delegations a visible incident to react to. It was exactly the kind of action that could accelerate the convening rather than prevent it. He was moving to control access, controlling who got into the main hall on day 3, controlling who got through the outer gate if anyone tried to leave and return with external support. He was building a box. She thought about boxes, about the specific nature of being placed inside a structure designed to contain you. She had spent 5 years inside a structure designed to contain her, and she had used every day of it to learn the structure's load-bearing points. She knew this palace better than anyone alive, better than Darius, better than crew, better than the guard commanders who had just been given their access orders. She knew the draft in the 3rd floor corridor. She knew the hidden panel behind the vanity mirror. She knew the undercroft passage and the service stairs and the linen storage room and the east courtyard and every rote between them because she had cleaned them all repeatedly in the specific hours of the night when no one paid attention to the Luna with the gray water and the split-open hands. She knew specifically that the main hall had a secondary access point that predated the Silverfang renovation, an old servants' passage that connected to the hall's east wall behind the formal tapestries, that appeared on none of Darius's updated architectural plans because the renovation that was supposed to close it had been redirected to a different project, and the closure had been documented but not actually executed. She had cleaned that passage. She had noted the discrepancy between the documentation and the reality. She had filed it. She found Ren at the 5th hour and told him about the passage. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been coordinating logistics for a complex operation across 2 decades, and had just been handed a piece he hadn't known existed. "How many people can move through it simultaneously?" he said. 3, maybe 4, close together. "That's enough." He pulled out the crude map he'd been working from. Varys and his core people through the main entrance. Visible, formal, they're supposed to be there. You and the witness contingent through the passage. You arrive after Darius has already committed to his position in the room. She looked at the map. "He'll have people watching for me." "Yes, that's why you're not where they're watching." She looked up from the map. "Ren, if this goes wrong, it won't go wrong. If it does, the documentation goes to Varys regardless. Whatever happens to me, the chain of custody stays intact and the formal notice stays on the table. Varys doesn't pull back." He met her eyes. "Understood. Say it. Regardless of what happens to you, the notice stands. The documentation goes forward." He held her gaze. "It won't come to that." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had been in this palace for 6 years, who had been her mother's field commander, who had apparently decided that rebuilding what had been taken was worth spending the better part of a decade cleaning kitchens and leaving symbols on walls and waiting for a 7-year-old girl to grow into whatever she was going to grow into. There was something she wanted to say about that. She did not have the words for it that weren't too large for this passage at the 5th hour before dawn. "Get some sleep," she said instead. He almost smiled. "You first." "Des." Dawn came in gray and cold. The palace assembled itself for day 3 with the particular efficiency of an institution that had been planning a ceremony for weeks and was not aware that the ceremony had become something else. The kitchen fires went up. The decoration staff began the final arrangement of the main hall. The guard rotations changed. The delegation households began their morning preparations. Selene dressed in her room, the green she had worn to the council meeting. She had it cleaned and pressed, and it was correct for today, correct in color and cut, and in the specific message it sent to anyone who was paying attention to such things. Not ceremonial, not submissive, not the wardrobe of a woman performing a borrowed role. Just a woman dressed for the day she had been building toward for 5 years. She wrapped her hands. The splits were mostly healed. The winter had passed. Her hands had been given less cause to crack in the warmer weeks. She wrapped them anyway. Habit. And because the wrapping was a thing she had done every day for 5 years, and today was not the day to change what she did with her hands in the morning. She was tying the last strip when she heard the knock. Not Calla's knock. Not Ren's. She knew before she opened the door. Darius stood in the servants' corridor outside her room, alone. No aide, no guard. Alone, in the corridor he had never once visited in the 3 years she had been housed here, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not calculation, not the assessment behind the eyes. Something that had been stripped of those things, leaving what was underneath. "I need to speak with you," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The room was small. With both of them in it, it was very small. He looked at the narrow bed, the table, the iron stove. He did not comment on any of it. His jaw worked once. "The convening this morning," he said. "I know what it is." She said nothing. "I know what Varys brought with him. I know about the records clerk." He looked at her directly. "I know about the Undercroft meeting last night." She held his gaze. Let him see that she was not surprised. "Who told you?" she said. "Does it matter?" It mattered. It mattered considerably. But she looked at his face and realized it was not a deflection. He genuinely did not know how she would use the information, was genuinely uncertain whether telling her served him or didn't. He was not operating from strength right now. He was operating from the specific place of a man whose structure was failing around him and who was trying to find one piece of it that still held. "What do you want, Darius?" He looked at the floor. He looked like a man in his 30s who had built an empire at 18 and had been running it on the logic of that 18-year-old's decisions ever since, every subsequent year adding weight to the foundational logic rather than examining it, until the foundation was load-bearing something so heavy that examining it had become unthinkable. "I want to know," he said, "if there's a version of this morning where I still have a kingdom." She looked at him. She looked at him with everything she was, with the 5 years and the gray water and the field report and the annotation in the margin that said monitor, with the knowledge of what her name in that document meant, with the night in the undercroft and the older woman's face and the pressure in her chest that was not suppressed anymore and had not been suppressed since the previous night, filling every room she walked into with something that had been waiting 22 years to take up space. She looked at him, and she did not hate him. She had thought, when she found the report, that she would hate him. She had prepared for hate the way you prepared for a difficult physical task. Steeled herself, braced for the impact of it. But hate required a certain kind of simplicity, and Darius Blackmoor was not a simple thing. He was a man who had made a choice at 18 and had been running from the weight of it ever since, who had married the heir he'd been told to monitor and had spent 5 years slowly destroying her because every day she stood in his palace was a day. The choice at 18 was still in the room. He had done it to protect himself from her. He had never understood that the thing he was protecting himself from was already done. "Yes," she said, "there's a version where you still have a kingdom." He looked up. "It's not this one," she said, "but there is one." She walked past him to the door. She looked back once. "The convening starts at the second hour," she said. "If you come into that hall and you stand aside and you let it proceed, if you let the witnesses speak and the documentation be presented and the question be answered, there is a version of what happens after that where you are part of building what comes next, not leading it, not controlling it, part of it." She held his gaze. "That option exists until the moment you choose not to take it." She left him standing in the room with the narrow bed and the iron stove. She walked down the servants' corridor and took the east stairs and moved through the palace toward the old servants' passage behind the east wall. Calla was there, and Henna and Marsh with his documentation case under his arm. Wren was there, and 3 people she had not met before, warriors from the look of them, the kind of men who had been waiting for a specific task for long enough that the waiting had settled into their bodies as patience rather than tension. She looked at all of them. They looked back. The main hall was 40 feet away through the passage, through the old door behind the tapestries. She could hear it on the other side. Voices, movement, the sound of a large room filling with people, the delegations arriving, the ceremony staff, the guards. And somewhere in that room, she knew, Darius's commanders positioned at the entry points, with orders they were about to discover they could not execute. She looked at the door. "Now," she said. She pushed it open. And in the main hall of the Silver Fang Kingdom, as the door behind the tapestry swung wide and the people in the room turned to see what had entered, the thing that Selene Ashthorne had been suppressing for 5 years hit the room like a wall of pressure. Not sound, not light, but something older than both of those, something every dominant wolf in the hall felt drop into their chests like a stone into still water. Heads turned, bodies went still. Darius was already in the room. She had not expected that. He stood at the far end of the hall, near the formal dais, and he looked across the length of the room at her. For a moment, just a moment, something moved through his face that was not calculation and was not assessment and was not the expression of an alpha managing a threat. It was recognition. Finally, after 5 years, recognition. She walked forward into the hall, and every step she took deepened the silence, and the silence was not empty. It was the specific silence of a room that had just understood, without being told, that what was standing in it had every right to be there. At the edge of the dais, Crew stepped forward. His face was controlled. His hand was moving toward the guard commander on his left. She looked at him. He stopped. From the main entrance, Varys walked in. Behind him, Tanis. Behind them, Delaker and the co-signatories, and Henna and Marsh with his case, and 20 wolves who had been waiting for this room for varying lengths of time. And from the tapestry entrance, behind Selene, Ren and the 3 warriors who had been waiting longer than anyone. The hall was full. Darius stood at the far end of it and looked at the woman he had spent 5 years making invisible. She looked back at him from across the length of everything he had built. The second hour had come. The silence in the main hall lasted exactly long enough for every person in it to understand what they were feeling and why. Then Crew moved. He did not move toward the guard commander. He moved toward Darius. 3 quick steps, a hand on Darius's arm, something spoken low and urgent at his ear. Selene watched it happen from across the hall and understood it for what it was, a handler repositioning his instrument, recalculating in real time, deciding whether the room could still be managed. Darius did not move. That was the thing Crew had not accounted for. He had spent decades managing Darius with the assumption that Darius, at bottom, would always choose the option that preserved his position. He had built his entire operational logic on that assumption. It had been correct for 22 years. Darius looked across the hall at Selene and did not move. Crew spoke again. Selene could not hear the words, but she read the shape of them. The urgent recitation of options, of contingencies, of what could still be salvaged if Darius acted now, immediately, before the room's momentum solidified. Darius said something back. 2 words. Maybe 3. Crew stepped away from him. Varys moved to the center of the hall. He did not require the room's attention. The room gave it, the way rooms gave attention to men who had been carrying something heavy long enough that the weight had become posture. He reached into his coat and produced the formal notice. The same document Selene had read in the courtyard, now with its authentication stamps visible from a distance. By the authority of the Continental Pact Accords, Article 7, which has never been repealed by any legitimate council, he said, this hall is convened as a witness body for the question of succession in the Emberwolf royal line. He looked at Darius. Alpha King Blackmoor, you are present. The record will note your presence. Darius said, I'm aware of what the record will note. His voice came out differently than it had in any room Selene had heard him speak in, not stripped of authority. The authority was still there. It was structural. It was in the bones of his voice the way 22 years of alpha dominance was in the bones of his body. But it was not performing. For the first time she could remember, Darius Blackmoor was not performing. Marsh opened his documentation case. He moved to the witness table that Ren's people had positioned near the hall's east wall. Quietly, in the night, with the specific efficiency of people who had been planning exactly this table placement for years. He laid the documents in sequence. He spoke their provenance aloud, each one, in the precise language of archival authentication. Selene stood near the tapestry entrance and let him speak. She watched the room listen, watched the pack leaders, Varys's contingent, Tanis, Delaker, the others who had arrived and found themselves in a hall where something was happening that they had not been formally briefed on but recognized, the way wolves recognize territorial lines, the way the body knew things the mind had not yet caught up to. She watched Crew. He was still in the room, standing near the side wall now, separated from Darius, with the expression of a man doing a specific kind of mathematics. Not the mathematics of power, which he had spent decades performing, but the simpler, colder mathematics of personal survival. He was calculating whether what was in this room had enough momentum to be irreversible. She saw the moment he concluded it did. His face did not change. Nothing about him visibly changed, but something in his posture shifted, a microscopic relaxation of the tension that had been holding him upright, and she understood that Lord Advisor Crew had just made the private decision to begin his own repositioning. Not today, not overtly, but the internal calculation had completed, and the answer had come back. This is done. He would try to find a way to make himself useful to whatever came next. She looked away from him. Henna had moved to the witness table. She stood beside Marsh with her hands folded and her back straight, and she spoke in the even, clear voice of a woman who had been waiting 22 years to say specific things in a room with specific witnesses. She described the Eastern Highlands court. She described the Emberwolf authority as she had experienced it, not abstractly, not in the language of historical record, but specifically in the material detail of a woman who had been 17 and present. She described the night before the operation, when warning had come through and certain members of the household had been moved. She described the child who had been placed west. She described the features of that child, and she looked at Selene while she described them. The room was very quiet. Selene stood in the quiet and let it be what it was. She did not perform composure. She did not need to perform composure because what she was feeling, the weight of it, the specific texture of being seen after 22 years of being unmade, was not something that broke composure. It was something that required it. You did not weep at the moment of recognition. You held the recognition, and you let it be real, and you stayed on your feet. She stayed on her feet. When Henna finished, the hall was the kind of silent that had a sound to it, the sound of people recalibrating fundamental things. Varys looked at Darius. "Do you contest the documentation?" Darius looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Henna. He looked at Marsh. He said, "No." One word. The hall absorbed it. "Do you contest the witness testimony?" "No." Varys turned to the room. Then the question is answered. The Emberwolf line is not broken. The heir is present. He looked at Selene. "Do you claim it?" She walked forward. The walk across the main hall of the Silverfang Kingdom took approximately 30 seconds. She had cleaned this floor. She had cleaned it on her hands and knees in the early morning hours before the court woke, with gray water and a rag, and the marble had been cold under her palms. She walked across it now, and it was the same marble, and she was the same woman, and everything else was different. She stopped in the center of the hall. "I claim it," she said. The pressure in the room shifted the way pressure shifted when weather changed. Not a sound, not a visible thing, but something everybody in the space registered in the same moment. Darius closed his eyes. What happened after was not a battle. That was the thing she had not fully anticipated. She had prepared for resistance, had run through versions of the next hour that involved Darius's guards moving against the delegations, that involved crew attempting a procedural challenge, that involved some final violent assertion of the structure that had held for 22 years. None of that happened. The structure simply stopped holding. It stopped the way structures stopped when the load-bearing points failed simultaneously. Not dramatically, not with the sound of collapse, but with the specific silence of something that had been under pressure for too long finally releasing. The guard commanders looked at Darius and received no orders. Crew looked at Darius and received no instruction. The court officials who had been present for the convening looked at the documentation on the table and at the faces of 7 pack leaders and at the woman standing in the center of the hall, and they performed a calculation that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with the basic survival intelligence that had kept each of them functional through the various transitions of this court. They stayed where they were. Darius opened his eyes. He looked at the room. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he had built when the building was over, and the thing he'd built was not what he'd intended. There was no clean word for what was on his face. Not shame. Shame was too simple, too resolved, too finished. What was on Darius Blackmoor's face was the expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a very long series of decisions and was seeing them all at once, all their consequences simultaneously visible, with no remaining ability to look away from any of them. He looked at Selene. He crossed the hall. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at her and said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough to be felt by every person watching. "I knew," he said. "From the first year. I knew who you were." She held his gaze. "I know you knew. He stopped. His jaw worked. A man in his 30s who had built an empire at 18, trying to find the language for something that the empire had not given him vocabulary for. "I don't know how to explain to you what I thought I was doing." "You were protecting yourself," she said, "from having to look at what was in that document." He looked at her. Something moved through his face. "Yes. By making me smaller than it. Small enough that I couldn't make you look at it. Yes. The word came out stripped clean. No qualification, no softening, no layer of self-preservation under it. She looked at him. She had thought about this moment in the abstract many times, had run through versions of it in the small hours of many mornings, in the servant's room with the narrow window, with her wrapped hands flat on her thighs. She had thought she would feel in this moment something large and resolving, something that completed a circuit. What she felt was quieter than that. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a process, not a moment, and she had no illusions about the timeline of it. It was something more preliminary, something that was simply the end of a particular kind of weight. She was done carrying his fear for him. "Step down," she said, formally, in this room, before these witnesses. He looked at her for a long moment. The room was absolutely still around them. Then he took a step back and he lowered himself. Not all the way, not to his knees, but to a half bow, the formal position of alpha deference that the Continental Accords recognized as the posture of voluntary abdication. His head went down. His shoulders dropped. The specific quality of dominance that he had worn for 22 years in every room he had entered went out of his posture like a fire going out. The room around them exhaled. Crew was taken into formal custody by Varys's contingent before the noon hour. Not violently. Calla had come forward with her testimony regarding the physician's visit and the pharmacopoeia inventory, and Marsh had documented it in the same careful hand he had used for everything else. And the process of accountability had begun its slow, institutional movement, the kind of movement that was not dramatic but was permanent, that did not require blood or spectacle to be real. The palace guard commanders submitted to the new authorities' direction by the afternoon. Most of them did it with the practical efficiency of men who had been hired for competence, not ideology, and who had identified where the competence was now required. By evening, the main hall had been reconfigured. The delegations were still present. None had left, which Selene noted as significant. You did not stay in a hall unless you had decided you were part of what was happening there. The pack leaders had stayed. She sat at the council table for the first time as something other than a performance. Varys sat across from her. Tanis and Delacre and the others ranged around them. Ren stood near the east wall with an expression she had never seen on him before, something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, and was probably both of those things pressed together into something that didn't have a single name. "The council structure," Varys said. "We need to begin talking about what it looks like." "We do," she said. "Not tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight," she said, "I need the documentation secured and witnessed. I need Crew's formal charges filed with the Continental Record. I need the physician identified and the pharmacopoeia inventory preserved as evidence." She looked at the table. "And I need to be done with this room for a few hours." Varys nodded. "Tonight." She stood. She walked out of the council chamber and through the east corridor and up the servant stairs to the third floor. She stood outside the locked room. She took the bone-handled key from her apron pocket. She had been wearing work clothes all day. The green dress had not survived the morning intact, and she had changed in the second hour after Darius's abdication without thinking much about it, just changed because the work clothes were what fit her body's habitual way of moving. She unlocked the room, went inside, did not light a lamp. She stood in the dark with the maps on the walls and the field report on the desk. The authenticated copy was with Marsh. This copy could stay. And she stood there for a few minutes and did not think about anything in particular. Just stood. The way you stood after a long walk, when your legs were still carrying the memory of movement, but the movement had stopped. The room smelled like dust and old paper and the particular coldness of a space that had been sealed too long. She would have it aired out tomorrow. She would have everything in the palace aired out, methodically, because that was the kind of thing that mattered. The physical reality of a space, whether it could breathe. She closed the door behind her and went to her room. Darius was in the servants' corridor. She stopped when she saw him. He was standing outside her door, not leaning on the wall, not sitting, just standing, with the posture of a man who has nowhere in particular to be and has accepted that fact. He had changed too. He was not in court clothes. He was in the plain clothes of someone who had stopped having a role that required a costume. She walked to the door. He stepped aside. "There's something I want to say," he said. She unlocked the door, did not go inside, turned to look at him. He looked older than he had that morning. Not dramatically, not the movie version of a man who had lost everything, sudden and total. Just the ordinary aging that happened when a person stopped maintaining a performance, when the face stopped holding itself in the shape of authority and became just a face. "I loved you," he said. "I know that's not worth much given how I showed it, but I want you to know it was real, somewhere under all the rest of it." She looked at him. She thought about the 5 years. She thought about the gray water and the split palms and the annotation in the margin, monitor, and the 5 years of slow, systematic erasure that had been, she now understood, the behavior of a man who could not bear to look at what he had done and could not find any mechanism but destruction to manage that inability. She thought about what love meant when it was practiced the way Darius had practiced it. "I believe you," she said. It was the truest thing she could offer him. "I believe it was real in whatever form you were capable of at the time." She looked at him steadily. "That doesn't make what you did with it something I can absorb into a simpler story." He nodded. He had not expected differently. Or if he had, the expecting had passed. "What happens to me?" he said. "The Continental Accords govern the terms of voluntary abdication. You keep your life. You lose the title, the lands, the formal authority." She paused. "What you do with the life is up to you." "The people I administered," he said, "the vassal packs, some of them will be fine," she said. "They weren't administered well. They'll notice the difference." He absorbed that. He deserved to absorb it without softening, and she did not soften it. "You should go," she said. "There are rooms in the East Guest Wing that will be assigned to you while the formal transition is documented. Varys's people will have the list." He looked at her for a moment. Just looked. The recognition that had been in his face in the main hall was still there, quieter now, the way fires were quieter when they had burned through the material that was feeding them. "I'm sorry," he said. She held his gaze. "I know you are." She went inside and closed the door. He said. She sat on the edge of the bed and unwrapped her hands. The knuckles were fine. The palm was fine. The skin was not cracked or split or raw. It was just skin. The hands of a woman in her mid-20s who had worked hard for 5 years and was now sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in a servant's room that would need to be reallocated to someone who worked in the servant capacity because she no longer did. She held her hands in her lap and looked at them. The things she had thought she would feel, the completion of a circuit, the large resolving thing, had not arrived in any single moment. It had been arriving, she realized, in pieces for months, for years maybe. Every document she had found, every symbol on a wall, every small act of not breaking when breaking would have been easier. Every choice to stay functional when the function felt hollow and the purpose was still invisible. The purpose had not been invisible. She had not been able to see it from where she was standing. The purpose had been there the whole time, being built by Ren in the palace's shadows, and by Varys in the northern highlands, and by Henna, who had been 17 and present, and had carried what she witnessed for 22 years, waiting for the day it could be spoken in a room with witnesses. She had not been alone in this palace. She had felt alone. The distinction mattered. She would think about that, about what it meant that a person could be held by a network they could not see, supported by structures they did not know existed, moving toward a purpose they could only infer from the pieces they were given. She would think about what it required to keep moving when you could not see the full shape of what you were moving toward. She would think about it later. Tonight she was too tired to think with precision. She lay back on the narrow bed. The ceiling was the same ceiling it had always been, the same water stain near the north corner, the same uneven plaster where the building had settled decades ago. She had looked at this ceiling on hundreds of nights and thought about floors and documents and symbols and timetables. She looked at it now and thought about what she wanted to do with the East Wing, whether to keep the current room arrangements or restructure them, whether the ceremony coordinator should be retained, what the first order of business for the new council should be, and whether the council's first sessions should be formal or whether there was value in starting informally, in letting the pack leaders sit together without prescribed protocol before the prescribed protocol began. She thought about the old stone under the new stone, the drafts in the corridors, the passage behind the tapestry. She thought, this palace is going to need a lot of airing out. She closed her eyes. 3 weeks later, she stood on the rebuilt east balcony at the first light of morning. The construction had been Wren's idea. The balcony had been structurally compromised for years, one of the deferred maintenance items on a list that no one had acted on because no one with authority had cared about the east wing. She had authorized the repair in the first week. The workers had finished it 4 days ago, and the stone was still pale where the new sections joined the old. The kingdom spread out below her sat, not hers exactly, in the way that Darius had owned it, as a possession, as evidence of dominance, more like a responsibility she had agreed to hold. The distinction was not semantic. It was the whole of what she was trying to build, the difference between authority that took and authority that was accountable to the thing it served. She was tired. She had been tired for 3 weeks, in a way that was different from the tiredness of the 5 years before, that had been the tiredness of suppression, of constant vigilance, of carrying something that could not be put down. This was the tiredness of use, of being fully in a thing rather than surviving alongside it. It was better. She would not pretend it wasn't harder in some ways, but it was better. Wren came to stand beside her. He had a habit of that, of appearing without announcement. She suspected he would always have that habit, and she had stopped being startled by it. "The Northern Reaches delegation departs this morning," he said. "I know. I'll see Varys before they leave." "He wanted me to tell you—" Wren stopped. "He said he would say it himself." "What?" "He said he'd say it himself." She looked at him. He was looking at the kingdom below, and his face had the quality she had noticed in him more frequently in the last 3 weeks. The specific expression of a man who had been running toward a thing for a very long time and had arrived and was now recalibrating what running felt like when the destination was underfoot. "Wren," she said. He looked at her. "It's done," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back out at the pale morning light on the kingdom's rooftops and the old stone walls and the new stone where the balcony had been repaired. "Yes," he said. "It is." She put her hands on the balcony railing, her bare hands, unwrapped, the skin uncracked and ordinary in the morning light. And she looked out at what she had agreed to be responsible for, and she breathed the cold morning air in and held it for a moment and let it go. Behind her, the palace was waking. She could hear it, the kitchen fires, the first footsteps on the corridor stones, the sound of a large structure coming back to life under different authority. A sound she had been part of for 5 years as a woman with a rag and a bucket, moving through it in the dark before anyone else was awake. She was still awake before anyone else. Some habits were just habits. She turned from the balcony and went back inside. There was work to do. There would always be work to do. That, she had decided, was not a burden. It was the point.